Hello, I'm Christina Davis, Director of the Program on U.S.-Japan Relations. Sorry, we had an echo for a moment, but I think we're all good. Welcome to everyone who's here joining us on campus and those of you joining us remotely. We are going to be having a panel on opposition party coordination and Japanese democracy. This is a great topic to be discussing as we're about to have an election here in the United States. Japan is a representative democracy, but the dominant party, the Liberal Democratic Party, was founded in 1955 and has only been out of power for 4 years out of those 67 years. Over the past 2 decades, the LDP has managed to successfully uphold electoral cooperation in a coalition government with a smaller party, the Komeito Party. But many of those in the room, myself included, and those who look at Japan from the outside find it quite remarkable that there could be a party that would have such consistent strength to continue as one-party dominant leadership within a context of a very consolidated democratic institutional setting. Certainly for us in the United States, the day before an election where many are expecting that party control of the US Congress will change hands from Democratic to Republican control, we look with puzzlement at the stability of politics in Japan. For Japan, there's been no such uncertainty. Certainly not the most recent election that was held this past July when the LDP and Komeito coalition easily achieved a solid victory. One could argue that the LDP has delivered strong results for prosperity that satisfy voters. LDP success and the natural incumbency advantage that we see in many governments around the world could account for why the LDP has remained politically dominant. But many political scientists and practitioners and commentators in Japan also look to opposition failure as part of the reason the LDP has stayed in power for so long. Since 2012, there have been 8 national elections, 4 in the House of Representatives, 4 in the House of Councilors, and throughout these elections, fragmentation and opposition party efforts with mixed success to coordinate have been a significant problem. There's a rationale for why you would expect the opposition to run a single candidate against the LDP, but it's difficult when you have party differences across multiple opposition parties, leadership differences, and electoral systems that can sometimes prevent challenges for coordination. And so when we look at the array of opposition parties, an array that changes constantly from Constitutional Democratic Party, the Japan Communist Party, Nihon Ishin no Kai, and many others, it is hard to keep track of it. And so we need to consider what are the strategic reasons, the institutional reasons that have led to the inability of the opposition to overcome the challenges and maintain a steady, successful campaign against the LDP. Well, to help us navigate this difficult problem, we have 2 leading experts who've been studying party politics in Japan and will help explain with presentations from their research. Our first speaker is Hikaru Yamagishi. She is a postdoctoral fellow during the current academic year with us at Harvard in the program on US-Japan relations. She's going to examine the turnout effects of party fragmentation, evidence from survey experiment in Japan. Hikaru's research examines how political institutions and post-industrial forces have shaped domestic political competition in advanced industrialized democracy, with a special focus on the case of Japan. After receiving her PhD at Yale University, where she examined these questions using a mixed range of methods, from interviews to surveys to statistical analysis, she's continued with this research, working on several different projects. She has a very exciting new working paper on gender balance in the governing elite, in which she looks at the selection of female cabinet ministers in a broad cross-national comparison to examine how democracy helps women get a little closer to the hand-holding of power in the cabinet ministry. But today we're going to hear from her about Japanese politics, looking close up at party fragmentation. Our next speaker will be Kentaro Yamamoto, who's going to address the opposition party cooperation on the ground, looking up at the case of Hokkaido in the 2021 House of Representative elections. Professor Yamamoto is an academic associate with us here at the Program of U.S.-Japan Relations for the year at Harvard. And before this, of course, he is professor in the Department of Law and Political Science at Hokkaido Gakuen University, where his research is focused on Japanese politics, looking at party realignment. He has published 2 major books written in Japanese on Japanese party realignment that offer a comprehensive analysis of the past 3 decades of rapid change in Japanese party politics. His most recent publication, written in English in the Japanese Journal of Political Science, examined party switching and policy disagreement, looking at scaling analysis of expert judgment. We're really fortunate to have these 2 experts help us understand the complicated landscape of Japanese party politics. Before I turn over to our speakers, we have an announcement that next week we will be talking about economic sanctions, featuring Nicholas Mulder, assistant professor at Cornell University, talking about his most recently released book, The Economic Weapon. Then we can turn straight over to Hikaru.
I go there?
Yes, that'll be.
Hello, my name is Hikaru. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Christina, Shin, and Jennifer, and Ken, for this wonderful opportunity. It's a privilege to present in front of all of you, many of you who know the context very, very well, and Professor Yamamoto, who certainly knows a lot more than me, so I'm excited to share my work. So today, I am presenting a paper about party fragmentation and turnout in Japan. And for many years, since Downs, even early as 1927 Gosnell, party competition has been a bedrock of democratic representation. And it's what's supposed to bring better outcomes for representation and public goods. But the puzzle in Japan, as many of our audience members know, is why the initially expected results of 2-party type competition isn't happening. And moreover, not even that, it seems as though we have a stronger 1-party domination situation right now in Japan. So I'm turning my focus from the all-important LDP to the other side and saying, we know the LDP is strong, they figured it out quite well, but maybe there's the other side that the opposition is weak. And why does that happen? So my motivating question is, why does a not so popular party win? So this is just a Reuters article from right after the House of Representative elections last October. And it says, Japan's Kishida defies expectations as ruling party easily keeps majority. So as we remember, many of us, this was after the Olympics, after the pandemic, insofar as it's over. And it was a surprise that they were still able to keep not just a majority, but still a very strong majority coalition with their smaller coalition party member, Komeito. So the scholarly research, there's a sharply identified work by Horiuchi Smith and Yamamoto published in 2018 that looked at, they did what's called a conjoint experiment, where you randomly see different attributes of each party platform. And they did this with a representative sample of the Japanese voting eligible electorate, and found that the Japanese electorate actually prefers the opposition's policies. And out of all the other parties, the LDP's was actually the one that they least preferred. So why is the Democratic Party, Liberal Democratic Party winning? So this is LDP seat shares since the beginning of modern Japanese politics in 1955. The shaded area is post-electoral reform. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. We're in the mixed member electoral system. And we see that in the last 4 elections, a little less in the last one, but still well above the 50% line right here. The LDP, this is just LDP seat share. It's not even with Kometo. So in the last 4 elections, they've either reached or approached the key 2/3 majority. And on the other hand, scholars have mentioned that the LDP might have a turnout advantage. There has been several works talking about how when turnout declines, the opposition loses. The biggest swings around the party alternation election of 2009, this one right here. The districts, Smith, Thies, and Shiner, find that the districts that lost the most turnout were the ones that gained the most turnout. So what seems to be happening is that these casual voters, who are people who sometimes vote, sometimes don't vote, and swing voters, people who sometimes like the LDP and sometimes don't, are the ones that are moving around here. But we don't have a great or focused explanation of why this could happen. Most of the literature on party politics is not about mixed systems. It's about, so the mixed system in Japan is composed of 2 tiers. Every voter gets 2 votes, 1 for a candidate in your district, 1 for the proportional vote in regional blocks. And how the mixed member system in Japan is constructed, it's one out of 2 types. The first type is the German type, mixed member proportional. And proportional refers to the overall aggregating equation that says everyone gets 2 votes and you can vote for candidates, you can vote for parties, but ultimately what's going to make the composition of the whole chamber is the party share votes. So it's a compensatory system. The system that Japan has adopted since implemented since 1996 is the mixed member majoritarian system. And that's where the 2 tiers are independent. And this is called a parallel system. So in Japan, about 60% of the seats go to single member district winners. So that is where the initial expectations of Duvergerian bipartisan competition comes from. They said most of the districts are single member districts. When you only have 1 winner, any other vote for the top 2 winners are wasted votes. So the parties at the district level and eventually at the national level should coalesce into 2 big groups. But Japan has a separate tier, which is the 40% that's left over, which goes to the party vote. And this has not been explored in the competitiveness versus turnout literature as of yet, or to this detail, at least for the mixed member majoritarian case. So the key takeaway for the purpose of this talk today is Bond and Thies has a Journal of Theoretical Politics piece in 2013 that basically says that when you have 2 sets of rules, the space in which parties can strategize expands. So you can have parties that focus on PR, so PR being proportional representation, usually proportional representation candidates, because they can focus on narrower segments. They focus on specific interests, like the segmented parties in Europe. And usually, single member district majoritarian system, the parties vie for the median voter. But because each party can choose between the 2, combine them, there's basically the party system is up to party strategy. And just observing what has happened, you don't really need much theory here for my paper purposes. The party system in Japan has been in flux. At one point, we thought it was heading towards a 2-party system, and now we have multiple parties on the opposition, while the moderate conservative side, which is the Liberal Democratic Party and its coalition partner Kometo, has been quite unified for since 1996. So party fragmentation, my theory, we're moving into my argument here now. I am basing mine in the turnout literature of expressive utilities. So the big question that this literature derives from is you have the fundamental puzzle of why does anyone vote? Because if people are rational and people are outcome oriented, meaning They think they are voting to change the result of an election. As the electorate gets bigger, it becomes less and less rational for anyone to turn out because the chances of you being the pivotal voter is so low, unless it's a very, very competitive district. On the other hand, so that's why the outcome-oriented models have given way to theories about how elites mobilize. So it's not that people are outcome-oriented, it's that elites are outcome-oriented and they call on voters to mobilize, and that's why competitiveness matters. And the other side, they're not incompatible, but just different approaches, which is the approach that I take today, is voters vote because there is what's called the easy encapsulation is called civic duty. You want to participate in democracy. You think it's your duty, or you have any sort of utility from going to the election. So this is an act-oriented theory of voting, meaning that the action of voting is what drives people to the polls. So bringing this into the mixed number majoritarian system in Japan, Japan is a parliamentary system. So famously, Gary Cox has written about how in parliamentary systems, the efficiency of the electoral system is that voters go to a legislative election where you are really choosing just the people who will be in the legislature. But what you effectively do is choose the party that will choose the executive. And so there's an efficiency in the legislative vote becoming a vote for executive representation. So the key term here is executive representation, meaning I theorize that at least a portion of people in Japan, when they vote, their ultimate goal is not to just get their district candidate, Mr. X, Ms. X, into the legislature. What they really care about at a certain level is who will actually be governing, who will be the majority. So the party side of this is that there are, in a simplified way, two types of parties in Japan. You have big parties that coordinate in single member districts, and voters can see that if I vote for a candidate for this party, they have a pretty good chance of being competitive to being in the executive. Whereas there are also small parties, smallest may be NHK. It would be feasible to think that people voting for NHK is probably not wanting it's not in the realm of their utility function that they think the NHK party is going to be the governing party. So there are two types of incentives because there's two types of rules. So for the case of Japan, I say people have different levels of how much they care about executive representation. So when there's party fragmentation, when the opposition fragments, national level competitiveness for the executive decreases. So from the point of the view of the voter, someone who goes to the polls wanting to vote to get a party in government, either to oust the LDP or keep the LDP, oust the LDP or get an opposition party into the LDP. When you have multiple parties, what's the point? So so the variables we have are party fragmentation. When it fragments, I expect people who care about executive representation turnout to decrease. So that's three variables. So to the research design is I had a nationally representative sample of 4,945 voting age Japanese. I did eligible voters, but they all responded that they were nationals. So they're all Japanese nationals. And they are from the ages 18 to 74. The limitation here is that I couldn't get anyone above 75 because it was an internet survey. Otherwise, regional gender is balanced on national statistical surveys. And what I do is show three different vignettes. So in Japanese, it's not as awkward, but there's three conditions. You randomly see one of three vignettes. The first one is the controls condition. And it says, given that the election, originally expected in November, has been moved earlier to this month's 31st, election management committees in various locations have been rushing to respond, such as securing voting venues. So this is just a information about elections coming, nothing about parties. So the other two conditions, I have T1 text here. What you just read goes at the end of these. So the blue highlights what's different between the two. I'll read the top one. House of Representatives election 2021, opposition unification gains speed. To government alternation, the opposition claims, the unification of the opposition is increasing speed and the possibility of countering the LDP as a united front is increasing, says an expert. So you see in the bottom, it says, decreasing speed, the front is decreasing. So it's basically just the opposite. Interest toward the coordination of the opposition has been increasing ahead of the election on the 31st. The opposition has been making progress on agreeing to coordinate in various single-member districts, increasingly solidifying the one-on-one composition of contest against the LDP. As a result, the chances of opposition infighting is expected to decrease. So everything is increase, decrease, opposite, except for this one sentence in the bottom one. The first one, it's a true piece of information, and the second one, the true piece of information is, however, in the House of Councilors by-election occurring currently, the opposition has passed on coordination, resulting in the breakdown. So this indicates opposition coordination, this indicates opposition fragmentation. And then the outcome, I asked, the election's coming up, it's fine if you don't vote. What is the percentage you think you're going to go vote? 0 to 100%. And then for executive representation, I ask, which one do you lean towards? A, you care more about a party that's claims are very close to yours, even if they might not win a majority, or you always want to vote for a party that's going to win a majority. So this is the executive representation dimension. Oh my gosh, I don't know. So I think this is a PowerPoint PDF situation. I'm sorry. So you can look at the numbers up there. So the dotted line is 0 effect. And then the very top 254 is 2.54 is the effect of people who saw the opposition fragmentation versus people who saw the opposition coordination. And the 2.54 is towards the right to the positive. So that indicates the people who said, I care about executive representation. Among those people, the people who saw opposition coordinating increased their own self-reported turnout indication by 2.54%. Whereas people who said, I don't care about executive representation, I just want to vote for a party that is close to what I like, there was no effect. And I'm going to wrap it up here for now. Conclusion, opposition coordination increases turnout for those who value expressing preferences for executive representation. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to appreciate Dr. Davis and Dr. Fujita for this valuable opportunity. As Dr. Davis kindly introduced me, I am the associate of US-Japan Relations Program and also a professor of Hokkaido University in Sapporo. And I have specialized in party switching in Japan since the 1990s to the present. Recently, I am studying the party system change in Japan, especially why the LDP recovered its predominant status since 2012. I think that the main reason is not at the LDP itself, but the opposition camp. What each opposition parties are fragmented with small seats leads to the absence of a solid rival for the LDP. From an electoral perspective, this means that not a few single-member districts will be without a strong rival to the LDP candidate. The first step in building a solid rivalry is coordinating a candidate in the SMDs. Actually, the opposition parties gradually became more coordinated since 2016 to 2021, with the exception of the 2017 general elections. However, the coordination of candidates has not always been smooth. What were the obstacles to coordination? My argument is that the obstacle was not only policy differences at the national level, but also electoral tactics at the local level. I published a Japanese book chapter in this September. The co-authored book titled The 2021 House of Representatives Election, The Quest for a COVID-19 Disaster and the Limits of the Opposition Coordination. This book is written by political scientists from various regions of Japan. Each author analyzed interesting districts in their own regions of residence. I was responsible for the Hokkaido chapter titled Coordination for the Formation of Opposition Coordination. Hokkaido second, a condition for the formation of opposition coordination, Hokkaido 2nd and 5th district. Today, I would like to present the contents of this chapter. Generally speaking, the coordination among opposition parties has usually been determined at the national level. Negotiations at the national level tend to focus on not only the electoral environments, but also the policy aspects of how to overcome fundamental differences, especially in foreign and defense policy. However, at the local level, the top priority is the electoral environment, not policy. This map shows the electoral districts in Hokkaido for the HOR elections. It consists of 12 districts in total, of which districts 1st to 5th district include Sapporo. The population of Sapporo is 2 million approximately, and about 40% of the population of Hokkaido is concentrated in this city. Outside Sapporo, the region is suffering from population decline and is mainly in rural areas, while the district that includes Sapporo is an urban type of district. In proportional representation, the entire Hokkaido forms a single block with its magnitude of 8. The mix of urban and rural districts forming a single proportional block for the entire region allowed smaller parties to focus on urban elections. There are relatively larger swing voters in urban districts, and smaller parties try to dig up proportional votes. Considering the so-called contamination effect, some small parties seek to run candidates in urban SMDs. The goal is not to win the SMD, but to increase proportional votes. Specifically, there is an incentive for the Japan Communist Party, the JCP, to run candidates in urban districts, which makes coordination more difficult. Various studies have been conducted on whether the contamination effect exists or not. But the point here is not whether the effect actually exists, but that the parties recognize it exists. Now, let's look at the results for the Hokkaido SMD in 2021. The top row represents the electoral districts, and in the 3 red districts, the coordination between CDP and JCP was not established, but the rest were united to CDP candidates. The yellow cells in the 2nd and 3rd rows represents the candidates who won in SMDs. The green cells represent candidates who lost in SMDs but won in PR. Of the 12 districts, the LDP Komeito coalition won 7 and the CDP won 5, where coordination was successful. From now on, we will look at Hokkaido 2nd district, where coordination was successful and the CDP won, and 5th district, where it failed and the LDP won. We review the reasons for comparing Hokkaido 2nd and 5th districts. These 2 districts both include Sapporo City in their districts, and the JCP has an incentive to run its own candidate in order to dig up proportional votes. In addition, the opposition candidate for District 5th, who is a single parent, had experience in social work, while the opposition candidate for District 2nd was born into a wealthy family and originally had a conservative policy orientation. Intuitively, the JCP supporters should prefer the candidate in fifth. However, the coordination was accomplished only in second. Why? In conclusion, I believe the reason lies in JCP's electoral tactics and the intentions of its supporters. We will start with Hokkaido 5th district. This district is the origin of CDP-JCP coordination. On the April 2016 by-election, coordination was attempted on a trial basis in anticipation of the summer HOC elections. This by-election was held following the death of Nobutaka Machimura, below left picture, who served as speaker of the HOR. Wada, top left picture, is the husband of Machimura's daughter. Despite he was the successor to Machimura, a big-name legislator of LDP. Ikeda, top right picture, experienced a good fight and gave a boost to coordination in the following HOC elections and beyond. Just prior to the 2017 HOR election, there was the formation of the Hope Party and the split in the Minshinto, but the coordination of the Hokkaido 5th district remained intact. And Ikeda further came close to Wada and she won in the PR. However, this coordination collapsed. In 2021, the JCP nominated its own candidate, Hashimoto, and Ikeda lost to Wada. Excuse me. Why the coordination of 5th district collapsed? The electoral tactics of JCP was important. The JCP intended to run a candidate in at least one of 5 districts that includes Sapporo. Among the 5 electoral districts, the 5th district was thought to be the least chance of winning for opposition candidates based on results of 2017 HOR elections. This table shows the number of votes of the LDP and opposition candidates in the 1st through 5th districts of Hokkaido in 2017 elections. Coordination took place in the 1st, 3rd, and 5th district, but not in the 2nd and 4th. In addition to 1st and 3rd districts, where the opposition candidate won, 2nd and 4th districts, if coordination had taken place, would have seen the total number of votes for the opposition candidate exceed that of LDP candidate. Ikeda in 5th district was the only candidate who, despite the coordination, acquired fewer votes than the LDP candidate. Next, about Hokkaido 2nd. In December 2020, Takamori Yoshikawa, elected in the 2nd district, resigned after money scandal was revealed. Because of the scandal, the LDP did not field a candidate in the April by-election. In anticipation of the HOR elections expected in the near future, Matsuki became a united opposition candidate and won in order. On the HOR election in October 31st, 2021, the opposition coordination maintained. Matsuki defeated the LDP candidate, Takahashi. The 2nd district has traditionally been an important district for the JCP, which has continued to run its own candidates in past HOR elections, but has dropped its candidate in 2 consecutive elections. Matsuki is said to be a political migratory bird, having switched from one political party to another. He has been considered a conservative politician, especially because his close relationship with Ichiro Ozawa. However, in his campaign pledges in 2 elections, he emphasized first to cut the consumption tax rate and second to promote the SDGs. Both were in line with the wishes of JCP supporters, and no other CDP candidate in Hokkaido strongly committed to the especially SDGs. The JCP also welcomed Matsuki's consideration and did not field its own candidate. Here is the conclusion of my chapter. The JCP appears to be acting on more practical logic, such as the possibility of winning elections and warm consideration for its supporters, rather than on the candidate's past history or essential ideology. The JCP is generally considered a centralized ideological party, but in reality, it may focus more on local political logic. Which of these two sides is more important in the JCP will also change the future of opposition coordination. Policy differences are not as important as previously thought, at least for JCP at the local level, suggesting that coordination can be successful if electoral tactics are aligned. If national level JCP is able to compromise on policy, there is still a possibility for coordination to progress. Currently, CDP is shifting toward cooperation with Ishin rather than with JCP, but the extent of JCP's involvement in such coordination will depend on JCP's own choice. Thank you.
Thank you. This is excellent to see both the perspective of strategic voting by the public, trying to understand their options, and of course, looking at the politicians in the parties and two different optimal strategies. I'd like to open up to have a discussion. We're going to have our first question by Willie Joe, who is academic associate with the program in U.S.-Japan Relations, associate professor at the School of Political Science and Economics, Waseda University. He's here at Harvard doing research on intergenerational value change, authoritarian cultural backlash in East Asia, and today he's going to ask our leadoff question.
Yes, thank you very much, Yamamoto, and Yamamoto, for these very fascinating and illuminating presentations. So I have actually a pretty long list of questions, but I will limit myself to a couple. And let me start with this issue about how opposition fragmentation among opposition party is sort of taken for granted. It's the sort of the starting point, and in Hikaru's presentation, the analysis focused on given there's opposition fragmentation, then these are how different types of voters would react, would they turn out to vote or not, and that depends on how much they care about the executive representation. In other words, the chances of opposition parties actually winning power at the national level. And I'm wondering, well, if these opposition supporters, they are well aware of their party's sort of, let's say, very low chances of gaining executive representation. Why haven't they exerted more pressure on the parties to coordinate so that they have a higher chance of winning? So instead of just saying, well, my party has no chance of winning, so I'm not going to vote. Why don't they, just perhaps have they not taken more initiatives to sort of push their parties to move in their directions or adopt policies which will enhance their chances of actually winning elections? And on the question of opposition coordination, a question and if possible, I'd like to hear from both of you, is whether it's whether coordination among opposition parties actually enhance their chances. In the 2021 election, as many of us remember, the opposition, there was coordination in many districts, especially between the Constitutional Democratic Party, the largest opposition, and the Communists. And it turned out that their seats actually decreased, mainly because they lost quite a few seats in the party list here. So the main opposition party did make gains at the district level, but it was overall it lost. In fact, it lost. The loss was quite unexpected because of the decrease in their party list votes. Right? And some analysts were saying, well, it's because they were perceived as moving too far to the left or moving too close to the communists. So I'm wondering, to what extent would opposition coordination, especially specifically between the Constitutional Democratic Party and the Communists, as Professor Yamamoto was describing in the presentation. To what extent would it help opposition parties to gain power or to gain more seats at the expense of the LDP? Because that's not what happened at the 2021 election, despite these parties coordinated. And I'm also wondering whether vote transfer patterns, in cases where there are coordination efforts, to what extent can you rely on, for example, supporters of the Constitutional Democratic Party or other opposition parties to vote for communist candidates? Would it always be the communists or the social democrats, the very small diminishing social democrats? Would they, what do they get out of this coordination? Right? Because their voters can probably be relied on to vote for the main opposition candidate. But the reverse, to what extent does the reverse hold true? And finally, I was curious because Professor Yamamoto said at the end about how the Constitutional Democratic Party is now trying to coordinate with issue rather than with the communists. And according to many studies, including expert survey, in fact, including the article that you co-authored in the Japanese Journal of Political Science, where the policy positions of Ishin is concerned, actually, in many respects, Ishin is closer to the LDP. Ishin's positions are closer to the LDP than to the Constitutional Democratic Party or other opposition parties. So, what are the prospects of successful coordination if the Constitutional Democratic Party or to try to reach some kind of agreement with Ishin? I have other questions, but I should stop here because I know many other people must have questions. Thank you.
I'll start with the first one. Thank you so much, Lily. So I have a few other results that I'm so happy you asked this because I can share. So your first question, I think is my paper starts and it's the more interesting, like this, you kind of know what happens in this paper. And I think what you're asking is the more interesting thing. So it's not covered in my paper, but I'm engaging with it in other projects. And so far in my field work and some of the other results in this paper, kind of combining them. So there are a few possibilities. I don't have an answer which one. The first one is, so if you look at, for instance, the Democratic Party for the People and the CDP trying to coordinate around 2018, I was speaking to the election management committee chair of the DPFP. And the idea was, so he had two different arguments. One is that CDP Edano doesn't, basically it's just a, everyone wants to be their own party head. That's one. But the other one, so it's a risk aversion. You have your core voters. So that's one possibility. The other thing that I thought was more interesting was when, this is another DPFP example, when they tried to engage medium voter types, especially young voters, the party came to the conclusion, at least around up until 2019, that they were just unreliable. I had pitched, because he was also very culturally multicultural. I said, look around, a lot voters are much more engaged in these larger public median voter type media engagements. Why don't you do that? And his response was that we tried it and one day they show up, the other time they don't. And the more we focus on those people, the less we can focus on our core voters. So it's just a prisoner's dilemma situation. And then the third one is, I think, a lot more difficult in that when we talk about opposition coordination, there's a lot of different ways coordination can happen. And the second part of my paper, I used like a machine learning method to see to have the machine determine conditional average treatment effects. And the strongest effect was, so when people saw the opposition coordinate, it on a large national scale, the biggest national scale that counted was LDP versus anti-LDP. And not to mean, do you like the LDP party, but in the dimension of national politics, keeping or ousting the LDP. And contrary to what we might expect, we saw the results showed that the higher the level of pro-LDP, the higher the conditional average treatment effect. But when you break it down by partisanship, what it showed that the positive slope was only in the opposition party members, meaning that the more moderate you are in the opposition, the higher the effect was. So these are all swing voters and the hardest voters to get. And I think that many of the, I think it's Cox, Halfrey, it's the technology of mobilization. These parties aren't quite equipped to mobilize the type of people, and they have the added difficulty of coordination because they all have to change their technology all at the same time and also negotiate some sort of party formation. And the last thing I wanted to share was an extreme version of my hypothesis would be that people who really like proportional representation will actually, when they, like you said, when the opposition could unite, might actually not want that sort of moderate position or a two left position if they were combining with JCP. I found the only partisan effects that came up were for the JIP. When the opposition coordinated, they were the one party where turnout declined by, I think it was 4.5 to 7, I forget, in the mid 4s, which was one of the largest effects. So, and they're well represented in the chamber now. So I think it's even more troubling that the dynamic that you said is seen in these results. The first question.
Let's go ahead and
Yeah.
Did you want to respond to some of the questions?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the next comment. And I answered the relationship between Ishin and CDP and for I think in the two axes, there are two axes relating to the opposition parties. First is left, like traditionally informing and deep policy, and another is the default oriented or not. And that's the key of the relationship between Ishin and CDP. And I think for Ishin and CDP until 2022 HOC this summer elections, the biggest enemy was not the LDP Communist coalition, but each other. And the CDP needed to defend its position at the largest opposition party by criticizing Ishin. And Ishin needed to attack the CDP to increase its seats and expand into power capable of changing the government. And in terms of policy, they were competing for votes of opposition supporters who leaned toward the center and were critical of the LDP Communist government. And I think this the Ishin has a mix of two groups, and one is original members with roots in Osaka, and another is not from Osaka. And since before and after the HOC election this summer, it has been pointed out that if the Ishin to separate the CDP and become the largest opposition party in PR, it needs to leave Osaka. But in fact, it cannot become an alternative of LDP Communist coalition unless it not only leaves Osaka, but also rehabilitates its image as a reform-oriented urban party and expands its foothold in the rural areas. Yeah, I thought it would be touchstone to see if a leader would be born who was not from Osaka, and Osaka already Baba was chosen. With Baba's leadership, I had expected that cooperation between the Ishin and CDP would be difficult to advance. But since the Kishida cabinet's approval rate has declined sharply, so the two parties appear to be rapidly approaching each other now. I think it is the historical event. In the early 2000s, DPJ merged with Ichiro Ozawa Liberal Party to transform itself from an urban party into a national party. It will be interesting to see if the Ishin and CDP follow that same path or not.
Great, thanks so much. And I think in part your answer to the question already answers our chat question about the role of the Ishin Nokai and CDP. So thank you very much for answering both sets of questions.
Perhaps I can ask two questions that are kind of related, one for each. And I'm really interested in kind of the local, the executive. One is you differentiate between people who care more about, the executive being changed, and others perhaps more about the local candidate. I was wondering to what extent that is an urban, rural, like whether, my prejudice of rural Japan, perhaps, the most important thing is the candidate. And I just wanted to get your sense, even, in terms of, and perhaps similarly in Hokkaido, and this is partly informed by my own conversations with Japanese Communist Party members in different places in Japan. Do you have any kind of sense to what extent like there's an identity among party members kind of as we're just fine in the opposition? I mean, we don't want to be this cult, but we actually kind of fine to be this eternal non-executive party, sort of as an identity. Not in Tokyo, not the leadership of the party, but kind of at the very basis that people, I just wonder what your sense is, whether that's something that's significant, or it's just, this is perhaps a few, older party members who have that. I don't know.
Thank you. And my paper is just a single case, so I can't generalize it. But after 2020 elections, I was talking to a journalist who had a memorable episode. The JCP has so far distanced itself from the race of power, and as experienced by the slogan, "We need a solid opposition party." And however, before last year's election, they participated in a power struggle for the first time, though in the form of limited extra cabinet cooperation. A journalist said that some grassroots supporters of the JCP professed to be very happy about it. Of course, the JCP Central Executive Committee, headed by Tetsuzo Fuwa, a veteran, might think differently. And however, generational change becomes an important issue for the JCP. I believe that these voices of its supporters will not be ignored, but the future, I can't expect. Yeah.
Yeah, on my end, I definitely think it's a urban rural situation. And the way I framed the paper made it unnecessary to bring that in, but that's exactly what it is.
Okay.
And anyone who I think has a snippet into a legislator's life also knows that with so few staff, maximum capacity bureaucracy, what legislators spend so much time on are these rural grassroots things for certain parties, though. So I think the interesting thing on this point is that I think another hypothesis is that there's self-sorting going on. And parties that have these grassroots are in a kind of equilibrium and stable with their grassroots members, but have no capacity to build a kind of coalition politics. And the type of legislators, anecdotally, that go into government. I have 5 cases that I know of personally speaking to, and maybe 10 more legislators that I've read about. And either there's 2 ways they can go. Either you're a really strong district candidate and it really doesn't even matter what party you are, so you're going to win anyway, or you are this type of majoritarian party and they quietly dissipate, basically because they don't have the Koenkai model of support. So I also think that it's a terrible, the exit chute of the PR, well, the exit chute of having to, the double tiers, not having one tier or the other, but just because the Duvergerian space is open all of a sudden, you can have these parties that self-sort into types of technologies and types of mobilization, which I think is also potentially a problem.
You want to jump in?
So either of you can answer this question or discuss it, I guess, more of a comment than a question. I guess Professor Yamamoto, you sort of started by saying that parties are coordinated, but not candidates. And I guess I maybe wanted to push back on that representation a bit, just and ask a question of what does it mean if parties are coordinated but are running multiple candidates in one district at certain times? Because to me, that would sort of suggest fairly weak coordination in the sense that they're still allowing for multiple candidates to be run at one time. And I guess it also implies to me that they're not coordinating on policy, right? Like you mentioned earlier that there's been discussion that Ishin is probably closer to CDP in terms of policy, right? And yet in Hokkaido, CDP is coordinating with the JCP, which is probably quite far from them on a policy perspective. So I guess it's just, it seems like there is some coordination, but it's quite scattered across both policy dimensions and across actually controlling how many candidates run in each district. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about in the specific case of Hokkaido, why is the coordination going on with the JCP primarily? And then if there's any latitude for sort of policy coordination that would actually merge parties or candidates to get beyond this.
Yeah, and in Hokkaido, Hokkaido is the exceptional case because in Hokkaido, Ishin is imaged by the Muneo Suzuki, so conservative. Yeah, and so Ishin in Hokkaido is not reform-oriented party for voters of Hokkaido. So that CDP in Hokkaido get close to JCP is rational. Yeah, so, but it is very exceptional, and so that Suzuki image is the answer to your question.
Can I jump in on that though? I think if I recall, the Communist Party in Hokkaido also draws on a base from the Nokyo working force. And so there's this surprising leftist group in Hokkaido due to agricultural interests.
Yeah.
And so the Socialist Party was also strong in Hokkaido in earlier periods. And that just leads into one last question, because we're almost at our end of time, which is how much does the pork barrel politics come in? Because, you know, executive representation is like you want to see control of the party, but to what extent is it you want something back to your district? And can you parse that out in terms of what the voter wants and also what the party strategy is? I mean, how critical is it to these people that they get that party policy, you know, Matsuki showing he would cut the consumption tax. And so it was a genuine policy seeking. I think that's your conclusion, is they really do care about the policy, but does that spill over to be also pork barrel politics for the goods that come back to your district, building a irrigation or road or something necessary. And so if you could both reflect on some of the questions you may not have fully answered, and my little addition at the end as the final remarks for our panel session.
My remarks are one that touches on a few of the questions, but I think the biggest thing that I wanted to find is because as academics, so much of our concern is about single member district candidate entry coordination. And when you look at public opinion polls, when you speak to some people on the street, it's really hard to get that coordination information. And the vision of bipartisan politics is that there's two big, easy to understand choices. So I wanted to see if even this, as Ken has mentioned, coordination at the district level has been improving and is happening in many places. But if just the nudge of there might be another big DPJ boosts this very, very weak, it's just a survey. I don't know what they're being primed about or reminded of, but I think it's worth looking at whether just the existence of 7 different parties on one side is enough. The last result that I want to share is I also have a behavioral measure, not just turnout intention. I asked people, there's an election coming up. Would you like links to party platforms and candidates, and for every single party? And people who saw opposition coordination, the only significant effects were party platforms for the CDP and the Democratic Party for the People, regardless of their partisanship. So when people get the hint that the opposition might coordinate, their interest and engagement with materials increase as well. So this might all be endogenous as well as that. People just aren't paying attention because there's just lots of parties.
And they don't want to look at 7 party clubs.
And my presentation is today is just a single case in, so all comments will be future work for me and how to generalize. So thank you so much.
Great, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our panelists for stimulating discussion. And remember, in the US, go to the tomorrow.